January 1945. The northern hills of Okinawa are still green, but the air already carries the faint metallic taste of coming war. Dawn breaks cold and gray over a small farming hamlet near Motobu Peninsula. Kimiko clutches her infant daughter against her chest as she steps out from the low stone wall of a collapsed farmhouse. Her kimono is torn at the sleeve. Her feet are bare and bleeding from days of hiding in caves. American soldiers emerge from the mist marines in faded green utilities, rifles lowered but ready. They move slowly, deliberately, calling out in broken Japanese phrases memorized from phrasebooks. Tomare, friend, Tomare. One Marine, a corporal from Iowa, kneels and opens his pack. He pulls out a small olive drab bar of army soap, still wrapped hand to clean. Folded white towel that smells faintly of laundry starch back in San Diego. He extends them toward her without speaking. Kimiko freezes. In every pamphlet she had been given, in every radio broadcast she had heard since childhood, the Americans were beasts who would rape, mutilate, and throw babies against rocks. Yet here, in the pale morning light, a stranger offers her the simplest luxuries: cleanliness, dignity. Her fingers tremble as she reaches forward. For the first time in years, she smells something other than smoke and fear. That small gesture soap, and a fresh towel would become the first crack in a wall of indoctrination that had stood for a decade. By the winter of 1944-1945, the Pacific War had entered its final, merciless phase. Japan's once expansive empire, built through aggression in the 1930s, was contracting under relentless Allied pressure. The road to this moment had begun long before Pearl Harbor. In 1931, Japanese forces seized Manchuria, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo. The League of Nations condemned the act. Japan withdrew from the organization in 1933. Full-scale war with China erupted in July 1937 after the Marco Polo Bridge incident. Japanese propaganda framed the conflict as a holy mission to liberate Asia from Western imperialism. Even as Imperial Army troops committed atrocities that would later be documented at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, the public at home was fed a steady diet of sanitized newsreels, school textbooks rewritten to glorify Bushido, and radio broadcasts that portrayed Japan as the destined leader of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the nation entered total war. Civilians were mobilized under the National Mobilization Law of 1938, which had already conscripted labor, rationed food, and controlled information. Women, in particular, were assigned dual roles: guardians of the home front and symbolic bearers of national purity. The government's Yamato Nadeshiko ideal exalted the quiet, obedient, self-sacrificing woman who would raise loyal sons for the emperor and endure any hardship without complaint. As defeats mounted, midway in June 1942, Guadalcanal; by February 1943, Tarawa and Saipan in 1944, the tone of propaganda grew darker. Civilians were told that surrender was unthinkable, that Allied soldiers were subhuman monsters who tortured prisoners, raped women, and murdered children. Pamphlets dropped by American planes urging surrender were labeled enemy lies. Anyone caught reading them faced arrest. School children practiced thrusting bamboo spears at straw dummies labeled American devils. Suicide was presented not as tragedy but as noble duty. The phrase Gyokusai, shattered jewel, became a euphemism for mass death in battle rather than dishonorable capitulation. By late 1944, the home islands themselves were under threat. The U.S. Navy's fast carrier task forces roamed freely, bombing Japanese cities in preparation for invasion. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9 to 10, 1945, killed more than 100,000 civilians in a single night, yet the military leadership refused to consider peace. Instead, they prepared the population for the final battle on Japanese soil. Okinawa, the largest of the Ryukyu Islands and only 340 miles from Kyushu, was chosen as the last major defensive line before the home islands. The island's 450,000 civilians, roughly half the population of pre-war Okinawa Prefecture, were caught in the vice. Many had relatives on the mainland. Others spoke a distinct Ryukyuan dialect that set them apart from Yamato Japanese. The 32nd Army, under LTHN Mitsuru Ushijima, planned to use the civilian population as both shield and labor force. Caves were expanded into vast tunnel networks. Women and teenage girls were conscripted into the Haimeri Student Corps, tasked with serving as nurses in underground hospitals. Boys as young as 14 joined the Iron and Blood Imperial Duty Corps. Orders were explicit. Civilians must not fall into enemy hands alive. Hand grenades were distributed to families with instructions to use them on themselves and their children if capture seemed imminent. The propaganda reached fever pitch. Leaflets, posters, and loudspeakers reminded Okinawans daily that Americans would subject women to unimaginable horrors. One widely circulated rumor claimed U.S. troops carried special knives designed to mutilate female genitals. Another insisted that prisoners would be paraded naked through American cities before being boiled alive. These stories were not fringe. They were taught in schools, repeated in village meetings, and reinforced by military police. Thus, when the American invasion fleet appeared off Okinawa's western coast on April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday, the civilian population faced a stark choice: remain in place and risk annihilation in the crossfire, flee south into the shrinking Japanese defensive zone, or, for the few who dared, surrender to the enemy they had been taught to fear above all else. For most, the idea of surrender was unthinkable. Yet a handful exhausted, starving, wounded, or simply unwilling to begin, to emerge from caves and ruined villages in ones and twos during the early weeks of the campaign, their first encounters with American troops who would challenge everything they had been taught. The American campaign to seize Okinawa, codenamed Operation Iceberg, had been meticulously planned since mid-1944. The island's strategic value was undeniable. Airfields on Okinawa could bring American B-29 bombers within easy range of the home islands, support the planned invasion of Kyushu Operation Olympic, and serve as a staging base for the final assault on Japan itself. On April 1, 1945, the 10th Army under Lt. Gen. Simon Believer Buckner, Jr. landed nearly 184,000 troops on the Hagushi beaches along Okinawa's western coast. The landings met almost no resistance. Japanese commanders had deliberately withdrawn, their main defensive line inland to the rugged southern spine of the island, tending to bleed the invaders in prolonged attrition. For the first few days, American soldiers advanced across open fields and quiet villages, almost as if walking through an abandoned landscape, but the civilians remained. Of the roughly 450,000 Okinawan residents, an estimated 100,000 to 150,000 were evacuated to the mainland before the battle began. The rest, farmers, fishermen, schoolteachers, mothers, grandparents, and children, were left behind. Many hid in natural caves or in the extensive tunnel system dug by the 32nd Army. Others simply stayed in their homes, hoping the storm would pass over them. As the battle intensified in mid-April, US units began encountering large numbers of frightened civilians emerging from hiding. The policy toward them was clear and unequivocal. From the outset of the Pacific War, the United States had adhered to the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, even though Japan had never ratified it. Captured Japanese soldiers were classified as POWs and afforded the same standards applied to German and Italian prisoners in Europe. Civilians, while not technically covered by the same convention, were treated under the broader principles of the Hague Conventions and U.S. Army Field Manual 27-10 Rules of Land Warfare, 1940 edition, which mandated humane treatment, protection from violence, and provision of basic necessities. In practice, this meant that when Okinawan women, children, and elderly men surrendered, or were found hiding, they were not shot out of Honda as Japanese propaganda insisted they would be. Instead, they were directed to collection points behind the front lines. Their military police and civil affairs teams processed them, names recorded, medical checks performed, and immediate needs addressed. The most pressing requirements were food, water, and crucially hygiene. American supply lines to Okinawa were enormous. By May 1945, the invasion force was supported by over 1,300 ships, delivering everything from ammunition to field rations, medical supplies, and personal hygiene kits. Each infantry division carried thousands of bars of G.I. soap, the standard olive drab, lye-based cake issued since 1942, rolls of white terry cloth towels, and even small packets of laundry detergent. These items, mundane to American troops, were stockpiled in vast quantities because prolonged combat in tropical conditions demanded constant cleanliness to prevent dysentery, skin infections, and trench foot. For the Okinawan women who stepped forward, many having lived for weeks without bathing, wearing the same clothes, their hair matted with dirt and blood, the sight of a fresh bar of soap and a clean towel was surreal. In wartime Japan, soap had become a luxury even on the home islands. On Okinawa, it was virtually unobtainable after 1944. Civilians had resorted to using ash, sand, or seawater. A single bar of American soap with its clean medicinal scent. It represented not just cleanliness, but an entirely different world, one of abundance, order, and unexpected mercy. These initial encounters occurred in scattered pockets across the island, near Yomitan, around Kakazu Ridge, in the shattered streets of Naha. Each time, the pattern was similar. A woman or small group would appear at the edge of a marine or army perimeter, hands raised, faces gaunt. Soldiers would signal them forward, speak softly, and offer the small comforts they carried. Interpreters, often Nisei, second-generation, Japanese, Americans, from the military intelligence service, would explain that no harm would come to them. For those women, the moment of receiving the soap and towel marked the beginning of a profound cognitive rupture. Everything they had been taught about the enemy collapsed in the simple act of a stranger handing them something clean. That collapse would deepen as the battle wore on and more civilians survived to reach the rear area camps. For the Okinawan women who emerged from caves and shattered homes, the world had been reduced to a single, terrifying binary: die honorably for the emperor or suffer unimaginable torment at American hands. Years of state-controlled education, neighborhood association lectures, and military police warnings had fused fear into identity. Many were in their late teens or 20s, daughters of farmers, young mothers. School teachers raved to believe that capture equaled eternal shame and physical violation. When the first Marines approached, hands empty except for canteens and small packets, the women braced for the worst. Instead, they received gestures so ordinary they felt alien: a nod, a half smile, a bottle of water, and then the soap. Not a luxury item, but a standard-issue bar-stamped U.S. Army. Its scent cut through the stench of cordite, rot, and unwashed bodies like a foreign language. The towel, too, was impossibly clean, soft against skin that had known only rough hemp and seawater for months. In that instant, the propaganda narrative fractured. The enemy did not leer or grab, he did not shout. He simply offered something to wash with. For many, the emotional impact was immediate and physical, tears they had suppressed for weeks, shaking hands, the sudden inability to speak. Survivors later described a sensation of vertigos, though the ground itself had shifted. One woman, interviewed in 1952 for an Okinawan oral history project, recalled thinking, "If this is what devils do, then perhaps we have been the devils all along." The moment carried no grand speeches, no ideological debates. It was intimate, human, and devastatingly simple. Cleanliness, once a privilege stripped away by total war, became the first bridge back to dignity. U.S. commanders understood early that uncontrolled masses of civilians on the battlefield were a liability. Hungry, panicked people could clog roads, reveal troop positions, or worst of all, be forced into suicide attacks by Japanese soldiers. The solution was systematic collection and rearward evacuation. Civil affairs teams, attached to each division, established civilian collection points, CCPs, within hours of the landings. These were rudimentary, barbed wire perimeters, canvas shelters, and guarded entry points. Once processed, civilians were moved by truck or landing craft to larger internment camps farther north. Away from active combat zones, the provision of Soap and towels was not an act of sentimentality. It was calculated hygiene control. Dysentery and skin infections could spread rapidly in crowded camps, threatening both civilians and the troops guarding them. Medical officers insisted on immediate bathing stations, often 55-gallon drums cut in half, filled with seawater and heated over field stoves. Soap became a frontline tool for disease prevention. It's just as important as sulfa powder or quinine. By late April 1945, more than 100,000 civilians had passed through these collection points. The orderly, humane process reduced resistance and encouraged further surrenders. Each woman who walked out of a cave and accepted the offered towel became living proof to others still hiding that surrender did not mean death. The Pacific Campaign rested on the greatest amphibious supply operation in history. By spring 1945, the U.S. Navy's Service Force Pacific had perfected a floating logistics chain that delivered over 700,000 tons of supplies monthly to forward bases. Among the least glamorous but most essential items were personal hygiene goods. The standard G.I. soap bar for ounces of sodium-based detergent was produced by the millions. Towels, too, were mass-produced in government contracts. White cotton terry, 20 by 40 inches, folded and packed in waterproof crates. These arrived on Liberty. Ships, LSTs, and cargo transports then were distributed through division quartermaster dumps. On Okinawa, supply officers maintained strict rationing for troops, but authorized liberal distribution to civilians. A single infantry regiment might issue hundreds of bars and towels daily to CCPs. The logistics were invisible to the women receiving them, yet they were the product of years of industrial mobilization. Factories in Chicago, railroads across the Midwest, convoys across the Pacific. For the recipients, the items symbolized something larger, an economy capable of wastefulness in the name of cleanliness. In a nation where soap had been rationed to slivers since 1943, the casual abundance of American supplies was almost incomprehensible. These three angles, the psychological shock, the tactical calculation, and the logistical machinery, converged every time a bar of soap changed hands. Together, they began to unravel the final defensive line. Not the caves of the 32nd Army, but the mental fortifications built around every civilian still in hiding. The humane handling of Okinawan civilians did not happen by accident. It reflected deliberate choices made at multiple levels of command, rooted in both moral conviction and pragmatic calculation. Lt. Gen. Simon Believer, Buckner, Jr., commander of 10th Army, issued clear guidance before the landings. Civilians were to be treated as non-combatants, deserving protection. His standing orders emphasized that the prompt and humane evacuation of Okinawan civilians will save American lives by reducing confusion on the battlefield. Buckner's staff incorporated lessons from earlier Pacific operations, Japan, Guam, Iwo Jima, where mistreatment or neglect of civilians had prolonged fighting and damaged morale. At the division level, officers such as Maj. Gen. Roy Geiger of 3 Amphibious Corps and Maj. Gen. Lemuel C. Shepard of the 6th Marine Division reinforced the message. Civil affairs officers, many of them pre-war missionaries, educators, or businessmen with experience in Asia, were given wide latitude to distribute supplies generously. They understood that small acts of kindness could accelerate surrenders more effectively than threats. The American Red Cross played a supporting but critical role. Field workers accompanied the invasion force, bringing additional comforts, chocolate, bars, cigarettes for men, and extra hygiene kits for women and children. Their presence reminded troops that the mission included not only combat, but also the preservation of human life behind the lines. These leadership decisions stood in sharp contrast to the Japanese military's approach. Lt. Gen. Mazuru Ushijima and his staff actively discouraged civilian surrender and in some sectors encouraged or ordered mass suicides. The difference in command philosophy was stark. One side sought to minimize civilian suffering as a means to victory. The other viewed civilians as expendable in the service of delaying defeat. Japanese treatment of captured Allied personnel provided the dark backdrop against which American actions appeared almost luminous to Okinawan women. From 1942 onward, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy held approximately 140,000 Allied POWs under conditions that violated every standard of the Geneva Convention Japan had signed, but never ratified for prisoners. Starvation, diets, forced labor. On the Burma-Thailand Railway, beatings, summary executions, and medical experiments were documented in post-war trials. Of the roughly 27,000 American POWs held by Japan, more than 40% died in captivity, compared with less than 2% of American held. Japanese POWs, women auxiliaries, and civilian internees in occupied territories fared little better. In Manila, Singapore, and Hong Kong, Allied women were subjected to malnutrition, forced prostitution, in some cases, and routine humiliation. Reports of these atrocities reached Japan through neutral channels and were deliberately suppressed or reframed as Allied propaganda. When Okinawan women learned through interpreters or fellow internees of the reciprocal treatment extended to Japanese POS on American soil, the contrast became unbearable. Japanese soldiers captured on Okinawa were fed the same rations as Marines given medical care and eventually shipped to camps in Hawaii or the mainland United States where they received regular meals, recreation, and even English classes. The women saw American troops washing their own faces with the same soap they handed out so freely. The symmetry was impossible to ignore. The decision to provide soap, towels, food, and shelter to enemy civilians raised profound ethical questions even among the Americans who carried it out. Some soldiers and officers questioned the wisdom of expending precious resources on people whose countrymen were still killing their comrades a few hundred yards away. Others saw it as a moral imperative and affirmation that the war was being fought not merely to defeat an enemy, but to preserve a certain idea of humanity. In the long run, these small acts contributed to the post-war narrative of reconciliation. The memory of unexpected mercy softened the bitterness that might otherwise have poisoned relations for generations. For the women themselves, the experience planted the first seeds of doubt about the absolutist ideology they had been taught. Many later reflected that the moment they accepted the towel was the moment. They began to reclaim their own moral agency. Together, these 6 angles: human shock, tactical necessity, logistical abundance, command intent, reciprocal contrast, and moral weight form the complete picture of a single, fleeting gesture repeated thousands of times across Okinawa in the spring of 1945. Each bar of soap and each clean towel became a quiet rebuttal to years of hate-filled indoctrination. That rebuttal reached its most intense expression in the weeks when the battle turned decisively and the caves began emptying at an accelerating rate. Late April through early June 1945, the southern third of Okinawa had become a cauldron of steel and fire. Kakazu Ridge, Sugarloaf Hill, Conical Hill. The Shuri Line, the names would enter Marine Corps legend as places where entire battalions were chewed to pieces in days. Japanese defenders fought from reverse slope positions, interlocking fields of fire, and miles of tunnels. Above ground, the landscape disappeared under constant shelling. Rain turned the coral soil into knee-deep mud that swallowed men, jeeps, and tanks alike. It was in this shrinking pocket of hell that the civilian surrenders began to accelerate by May 1st. 10th Army Intelligence estimated that more than 60,000 Okinawan civilians had already been evacuated to northern collection camps. Many had come out during the relatively quiet first weeks of the campaign. Now, as the Japanese defensive perimeter contracted to a few square miles around the ancient Shuri Castle, the remaining civilians faced a stark reality: stay and die with the army, or risk the unknown with the Americans. The caves became the crucible. Some were natural limestone formations enlarged by army engineers. Others were family tombs traditionally used for ancestor worship, now packed with dozens of terrified people. Air inside was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, wet earth, and the sweet rot of wounds. Food had dwindled to handfuls of rice paste and wild yams. Water came from seepage or captured rainwater. Babies cried until their mother's milk dried up. The propaganda still echoed in their ears, but hunger and the unending roar of artillery had begun to drown it out. On May 18th, near the village of Tomigasuku, a group of 23 women and children, led by a 52-year-old widow named Haruko, emerged from a large burial cave just behind the Japanese front line. They had waited 3 days for a lull in the shelling. When it came, they tied white cloth strips to bamboo poles and stepped into daylight. A platoon from the 1st Marine Division spotted them immediately. The Marines held fire, lowered weapons, and waved them forward. At the battalion aid station, 400 yards back, corpsmen and civil affairs personnel took charge. The women were filthy, many with dysentery sores, scabies, and infected cuts. One teenage girl had lost an eye to shrapnel. The first thing the Americans did after giving them water was direct them to an improvised bathing area for large metal drums filled with heated seawater. Set behind a canvas screen for privacy, a Navy pharmacist's mate named Robert Callahan later wrote in a letter home, "They just stood there staring at the soap like it was gold. We handed each one a bar and a towel. Some started crying before they even touched the water." Soap was the standard GI issue, hard, tan, smelling faintly of carbolic acid. The towels were fresh from the last resupply drop, still creased from packing. One by one, the women stepped behind the screen. They washed in silence at first. Then small sounds emerged, soft sobs, murmurs of disbelief. The splash of water on skin that had not felt anything clean in months. For Haruko, the moment came when she lathered her daughter's hair. The girl, 9 years old, had been taught to fear the giant foreign devils with red hair and blue eyes. Yet the Marine standing guard 20 feet away simply turned his back, giving them privacy. When they finished, he handed them clean army blankets and pointed toward the truck that would take them north. Word spread through the remaining caves by whisper and gesture. Survivors who reached the American lines returned with stories that contradicted everything official propaganda had said. "They gave us food," one woman told, others still hiding. "They gave us soap. They did not touch us." Each account chipped away at the last barrier of fear. By late May, the rate of civilian surrenders surged. On some days, more than 1,000 people walked out of the southern lines. Interpreters from the Military Intelligence Service worked around the clock, reassuring families that no harm would come. The sight of women and children being loaded onto trucks wrapped in blankets, faces washed and calm, became a quiet but powerful psychological weapon. Japanese soldiers who witnessed it from their positions sometimes wavered. A few even surrendered themselves. The turning point was not a single battle or a dramatic speech. It was cumulative, intimate, and unstoppable. Thousands of small, human transactions each, beginning with the offer of a bar of soap and a fresh towel that proved surrender was not death, but life. That proof would reach its fullest expression in the final weeks. As the last pockets of resistance collapsed and the caves emptied for good, early June 1945, the Japanese 32nd Army was being ground into the coral. Shuri Castle, the ancient heart of Okinawan culture, had been reduced to rubble by naval gunfire and army howitzers. General Ushiojima's headquarters tunnel was encircled. Supplies were gone. Ammunition was rationed to a few rounds per man. The end was no longer undoubtedly the manner of it. In the final caves south of Mabuni, the last large concentrations of civilians clung to life. Some groups numbered in the hundreds, families who had fled south in April, now trapped between the collapsing Japanese lines and the advancing Americans. The air was poisonous with smoke, cordite, and the stench of gangrene. Children no longer cried. They had no strength left. Many adults had already chosen death, some by grenade, others by drowning in the surf, rather than face what they still half believed would be torture. Yet the surrenders continued to grow. On June 4th, near Kunishi Ridge, a single Marine patrol from the 1st Division watched as more than 200 civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly filed out of a complex of connected tombs. They carried white flags made from torn kimono sleeves. The Marines secured the area, called for corpsmen, and began the now familiar routine. At the forward collection point, a makeshift tent city sprang up overnight. Trucks rolled in with cases of soap, towels, rations, and medical kits. Civil affairs teams worked methodically. Women were separated for privacy, guided to bathing stations where hot water steamed in the tropical dusk. Each received the same items: 1 bar of soap, 1 clean towel, a blanket, and a can of fruit cocktail that tasted like a memory of peace. One survivor, a 24-year-old named Setsuko, later described the scene in a 1950 interview preserved by the Okinawa Prefectural Peace Memorial Museum. "I thought the soap would burn my skin because it was from the enemy. But when I washed, the dirt came away in black rivers, and with it went the fear. I looked at my daughter's face clean for the first time in months, and I understood we would live." The psychological turning point was collective. As hundreds emerged daily, stories circulated rapidly among the remaining holdouts. Interpreters repeated the same assurances: "You will be fed. You will be safe. The war is ending." Nisei linguists, many of whom had families still in Japan, spoke with quiet authority, bridging language and terror, by June 10th. The rate had become a flood. On some days, more than 3,000 civilians surrendered in a single 24-hour period. Entire cave systems emptied at once. Japanese soldiers, witnessing the exodus, sometimes followed unarmed, heads bowed, knowing the fight was over. Others fought to the last, but their numbers dwindled. The final, decisive moment came on June 21st to 22nd. General Ushijima and his chief of staff committed ritual suicide in their command cave. With the army's leadership gone, organized resistance ceased. In the hours that followed, the remaining civilians, those who had held out longest, began streaming toward. American lines in ragged columns at one collection point near the southern tip. A young Army lieutenant named Thomas Hargrove oversaw the processing of nearly 800 people in a single afternoon. He later reported, "They came out looking like ghosts. We gave them soap and towels first, before food, before anything else. You could see the change in their eyes the moment the water touched them. It was like watching people wake up from a nightmare." The caves fell silent. The last major group surrendered by June 23rd. 10th Army records showed that between April 1st and the end of June, approximately 142,000 Okinawan civilians were processed through collection points and internment camps, far more than pre-invasion estimates had predicted. The overwhelming majority were women, children, and the elderly. The turning point had not been marked by flags raised over a ruined castle or a formal surrender ceremony. It unfolded in thousands of quiet individual instants. A hand extended with a bar of soap, a towel unfolded, water poured over bowed heads. Each gesture dismantled the final pillar of the propaganda that had demanded death over dishonor. With the last cave emptied and the last towel distributed, the Battle of Okinawa was effectively over. What remained was the long, painful reckoning with the living, with the dead, and with the meaning of mercy in the midst of total destruction. By the end of June 1945. The Battle of Okinawa was over. The island lay in ruins. Villages erased, fields cratered, coral ridges pulverized into gray dust. 10th Army casualty figures were staggering: 12,520 Americans killed. Another 38,916 wounded. Japanese losses were catastrophic. Nearly 110,000 soldiers dead. Many in the final bonsai charges or by their own hand. Civilian deaths are still debated. Conservative estimates place the toll at 94,000 to 150,000, roughly one-third of the pre-war. Population killed by artillery, starvation, suicide, or crossfire. Yet amid this devastation, the survival of more than 142,000 Okinawan civilians stood as a quiet, improbable counterpoint. The majority were women, children, and the elderly who had surrendered rather than die. They now filled a network of internment camps stretching from the northern Motobu Peninsula to the central Motobu area. These were not prison camps in the punitive sense. They were temporary shelters of canvas tents, Quonset huts, and salvaged tin roofing, surrounded by low wire fences, more to keep curious children in than to keep anyone out. Conditions, while austere, were humane. Daily rations included rice, canned meat, vegetables, and powdered milk, far more than most had seen in years. Medical teams vaccinated against typhus and cholera, treated wounds, and delivered babies under electric lights. Bathing stations remained open. Soap and towels continued to be distributed weekly. Red Cross workers organized small schools for children, taught basic English phrases, and arranged recreational activities with donated baseballs and jump ropes. For the women, the psychological adjustment was gradual and uneven. Many arrived in shock, still expecting betrayal at any moment. Some refused to undress for medical exams. Others wept when offered hot water. But as days turned into weeks, patterns emerged. Mothers began to smile when their children played without fear. Older women shared stories around cooking fires, comparing the American food to what they remembered from before the war. The simple routine of washing lathering with soap, drying with a fresh towel, became a daily ritual of reclamation. 10th. Army Civil Affairs reports noted a marked change in demeanor within the first month. Initial terror gives way to cautious gratitude, one officer wrote. The provision of personal hygiene items has proven the single most effective trust-building measure. Interpreters documented countless small conversations, women asking why the Americans were kind, why they did not rape or kill, why they gave without demanding anything in return. The answers delivered quietly were always the same, because it was right, because the war was against armies, not people. Repatriation began in July. Priority went to the sick, the very young, and the elderly. Landing craft ferried them north to ports on the main island, then 2 larger ships bound for Kyushu and Honshu. Each departing group received a small care package: more soap, towel, canned food, and a printed note in Japanese, assuring them of safe passage. By August, when Japan surrendered, more than 80,000 civilians had been returned home. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th brought the war to its abrupt close. For the Okinawan women still in camps, the news arrived via loudspeaker announcements and translated newspapers. Many sat in stunned silence. The empire they had been taught was eternal had collapsed in days. In the camps, the atmosphere shifted once more. Fear of invasion was replaced by uncertainty about the future. Yet the memory of those first bars of soap and clean towels lingered, a tangible proof that survival was possible. Even in defeat, the repatriation of Okinawan civilians continued into the autumn of 1945 and beyond. By October, most of the remaining internees had been returned to their home villages, or what remained of them. Many found only ashes, collapsed stone walls, and fields overgrown with weeds. Reconstruction would take decades. Yet the women who had survived carried with them something intangible. The knowledge that mercy had existed even in the darkest hour of the war, in the years immediately following surrender. Japanese society underwent seismic change. The Allied Occupation Authority, SCAP, under General Douglas MacArthur, dismantled the militarist state, purged wartime leaders, and imposed a new constitution that renounced war. For women, the transformation was especially profound. The 1947 Constitution granted universal suffrage, equal rights in marriage and inheritance, and legal protections previously unimaginable. Many Okinawan women who had once accepted the Yamato Nadeshiko ideal now quietly rejected it. They had seen the cost of blind obedience. They had also experienced a foreign power that, at least in their moment of greatest vulnerability, chose kindness over cruelty. Oral histories collected in the 1950s and 1960s reveal recurring themes. Women spoke of the soap and towel as the first proof that the Americans were human. Some kept the faded, threadbare towels for years, folding them carefully in drawers as relics of a turning point in their lives. Others used the memory as a private anchor during the difficult post-war years of food shortages, black markets, and rebuilding. I wash my face every morning, one survivor told an interviewer in 1965, and remembered that someone had once thought my cleanliness mattered. The contrast with Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners lingered as a bitter footnote. While thousands of American POWs returned home emaciated and scarred, the Japanese women who had feared the worst found themselves treated with dignity. This asymmetry fueled post-war debates about war crimes, morality, and reciprocal humanity. It also contributed, however modestly, to the slow thaw in U.S.-Japan relations. The generous treatment of civilians on Okinawa became one small but frequently cited chapter in the narrative of reconciliation that made the alliance possible. Okinawa itself remained under U.S. administration until 1972, longer than the main islands. The bases established during the occupation grew into major installations, shaping the island's economy and politics to this day. Yet many older Okinawans still draw a line between the violence of 1945 and the unexpected compassion that followed. Annual peace ceremonies at the cornerstone of Peace Monument in Itomen list the names of the dead soldiers and civilians alike, but the stories of survival are told separately. In family gatherings and local museums, the small acts of hygiene and care did not end the war. They did not prevent the atomic bombings or the fire bombings of Japanese cities. They did not erase the immense suffering on all sides. But they did something narrower and perhaps more enduring. They allowed thousands of women to walk out of caves and tombs into a future they had been taught was impossible. In doing so, they quietly disproved the ideology that had demanded their death. Decades later, the memory of those bars of soap and fresh towels endures as a reminder that even in total war, individual choices can pierce the armor of hate. They marked the moment when fear began to yield to something simpler: human recognition. In the vast machinery of World War II, where cities burned and millions perished in calculated violence, a handful of ordinary objects, a bar of army-issue soap, a folded white towel became unlikely instruments of revelation. They did not stop the Battle of Okinawa. They did not spare the island from becoming one of the bloodiest battlefields of the Pacific. They could not undo the years of indoctrination that had convinced an entire civilian population that death was preferable to capture. Yet in the hands of frightened women stepping out of caves into uncertain light, those simple items carried a power that no weapon possessed, the power to contradict hate with fact. The gesture was small, almost invisible amid the roar of artillery and the scale of suffering, but its effect was precise. It pierced the veil of dehumanization that propaganda had woven so tightly. It reminded people on both sides of the barbed wire that the enemy was also capable of mercy. That dignity could survive even when everything else had been stripped away. In the decades since 1945, Okinawa has rebuilt, its scars softened by time, tourism, and the slow work of memory. The cornerstone of peace lists more than 240,000 names: Japanese, American, Okinawan, in granite under open sky. Yet the private stories endure: the grandmother who still keeps a frayed towel in a lacquered box, the mother who taught her children that the Americans who once handed her soap were not monsters, the quiet understanding that humanity can persist in the smallest acts even when the world demands its extinction. This is what those bars of soap and fresh towels ultimately signify: not the triumph of one side over another, but the fragile, stubborn persistence of recognition across the lines drawn by war. In a conflict defined by annihilation, they stand as proof that a single moment of unexpected kindness can plant the seed of something larger: the possibility of peace. Not as an abstract ideal, but as a lived human reality. The war ended. The hatred did not vanish overnight. But in those quiet, cleansing moments, the first steps toward reconciliation began.